You are now going to take part in a lecture on economics for time period 6 that I have dubbed Voodoo Economics. This phrase was used for a particular part of economics that the U.S. saw during the Reagan years, but it also goes towards some connections with other forms of economic free trade situations happening throughout the world during this time. More in particular, this will cover 6.3, some items there that deal with economic changes for time period 6. And most of these new challenges and responses that we're going to talk about today are coming directly out of some Cold War and World War II situations that involve around politics being contested between communism and even some would say fascism to a little bit, and capitalism, which is Western versus Eastern. Those kind of principles are going to divide out certain countries and the superpowers after World War II, of course, and will dominate how most of these principles discussed within your key concept stuff for 6.3, how those changes are occurring. And really, truly, you look at the modern day communists, which are post-World War II countries like Russia and China, as we move into places like Cuba and South America, where you'll see some of those Cold War tensions, and their plan as far as how they're going to go about making economics controlled by the state and the government versus how capitalists will allow a free market approach to take place. That's going to be the overwhelming visual there as far as that go between one and another. And of course, the main challenge by any of these countries or groups of countries and thought processes, economically speaking, is to outproduce your enemy. You're trying to show superiority. Once again, that those connections can be made also to social customs and traditions and political aspects as well, which you've already hopefully covered with some of your Cold War and beyond type of lessons. Let's start with the Soviet Union. There is a switchover of power after Lenin passes away, and after some tense months of who's going to take over. Joseph Stalin, is the one who grabs the control there of the Soviet Union, and he will maintain that power and authority all the way through the later part of the 20s and going into World War II and beyond a little bit until he passes away. He has an economic plan, and those plans, I should say, are typically known as 5-year plans. There are several that you need to keep your eye on. Let's start with the first one. 1928 to 1933, this first 5-year plan is characterized by a few basic things. Rapid industrialization. He does not want to make the same mistakes that Lenin and Tsar Nicholas II, for sure, that they made prior to this. And so he has to build up heavy industry. And he also wants to deal with agricultural concerns because, once again, one of the main problems coming out of World War I is that Russia was behind the turn there a little bit when it came to agricultural production. Of course, you should know why. It's the serfdom issue that has been corrected by some of the reformists prior to Nicholas II's assassination. And that leads to some issues there with growing crops and producing those things at cheap labor and cheap rates. He undergoes a massive infrastructure plan to build projects, roads, railroads especially, canals, things that can move goods faster and cheaper. So look at your transportation and communication innovations. He's trying to do all of those major infrastructure projects. As a result as well of that collectivization type of plan, he leads to the death of the kulaks, which are a group of independent wealthy farmers. They're known as kulaks in Russia, and a lot of them die because the state picks up all of those farms that are really, really valuable, takes them out at the hands of these independent farmers and stuff. And once again, we're heading towards massive communistic control here, where the state controls all of that distribution and growth and prices and all that stuff. And so those independent wealthy farmers are quickly finding it really hard to make ends meet, and there's starvation, et cetera, as the state takes those resources, those produced goods, those produced foods, and then collects them and then doles them out. Workers eventually cannot keep up the pace that is set in quotas and stuff like that Stalin puts into place. They can't keep up agriculturally speaking, but the industry does in fact take off. Like around 180%, according to some people, is the rate in which the industry grows during this first 5-year plan. And of course, agriculture workers are being shifted into factories and stuff too. So because of that and some bad weather and stuff like that are also making things problematic for growing seasons, there are massive famines by 1932. Millions of citizens in Russia are dying as a result. The second plan is from 1933 to 37. We try, or at least Stalin tries, to kind of learn from the issues of the previous one, and have some expanded goals that are trying to get met. Since industry did grow during the first plan, he wants to keep that growth moving forward. And part of that is, once again, communication, which is railroads. He will undertake building more and more railroads. The one of which that is going to be super important for kind of directly segueing into World War II is when he tries to build a railroad through an occupied Japanese territory on his way to some warm water where right north of Korea used to be. Japan occupies that territory there during their imperialistic expansion, and Russia will build a railroad through a small portion of it, heavily defended by a military, which grows tensions between Japan and Russia. A lot of these things end up with some pretty mixed results here. To achieve his initial plan during the second industrial 5-year plan, incentives are used. And I put incentives in quotes because some of them are positive, some of them are negative. So if you meet your quota, you're given certain rewards. And obviously, if you don't meet your quota, you're given certain punishments. So sometimes you're trying to avoid those punishments. That's why I put, once again, incentives in quotes there. As a result, though, the standard of living, or SOL, as I'll call it during this lecture, that is majorly decreasing for the populace. Consumer goods, when they are being produced, are really bad in quality, and they're not really useful for everyday application. And then this actually does include agricultural goods as well that are used, like plows and stuff like that. They break down very easily because they're just not made with good quality. They're just trying to meet quotas, right? However, the military production is steadily increasing. He is trying to, once again, make themselves out to be a military power once again, and that takes a good military presence. He is definitely working that system as part of the industry output. And then finally, the third 5-year plan of note for Stalin is 1938 to 41. This one's cut short, obviously. It's about 3 years or so because Germany has pushed for war and has started aggression movements, which has started World War II. And therefore, Russia has to call off plans and shift workers into the fighting arenas and stuff like that. So weapons were the main goal at that point. And obviously, the result of that is a success because by far, even though Russia is taking still heavy losses during this World War II arena fighting, theater fighting, however you wish to describe it, they are able to hold their ground and eventually start pushing back on Germany. And of course, we meet in Berlin, and Germany's defeated, and end of war, yada, yada, yada. All the post-war stuff after fighting in 45 ceases. Germany is defeated and Italy surrenders shortly thereafter. Russia still has Japan to deal with, but they're letting the United States kind of take care of that as they kind of sandbag their way into some stability there. Really slow going. They say they're on their way, but they never quite get there, that kind of thing. In the post-war Russian world, however, industry is continuing to keep up the pace that they started prior to World War II. Industry more than doubles by 1952, and Stalin wanted to make the USSR the leading industrial power by 1960. He comes pretty close, actually. The U.S. is still producing more, but that lead has shrunk considerably during some of these post-war times. And then we move on to China, the next great communistic state that happens as a result of World War II. And this is all starting with Mao. Mao Zedong has taken over due to the revolution there, which is one of your major dates you had to know. He saw Russia, Mao did, and saw that as a great opportunity to kind of mimic and copy what Russia was doing. So China actually installs their own plans in 1958. 1958 is when Mao will start the first one. His goal, which is not really a 5-year goal, but it's a long-term 30-year goal. And 1988 was the target date he had for that. His 5-year plan is to lead a second attempt at building up agricultural production and industry following the kick out of the Japanese that was dominating China for the better part of a decade to 2 decades. That 5-year plan in 58 led to another 5-year plan later on that we commonly known as now as the Great Leap Forward. It's a Russian modeled plan. You got to improve industry. You got to improve agriculture. The way that Mao does agricultural improvement is through the development of communes. And these were kind of like a military-styled organization of families on chunks of land. And there were typically 5,000 families to each one of these communes. Really, truly, you can kind of classify this as basic serfdom. The state organizes and controls all the production and output and prices and stuff. And they broke these families down into military-styled organizations. And each commune had to give everything to the state, and the state kind of dished those things out to everybody else. This was the kind of flip of the coin to industrial output and buildup. Mao does encourage that, and in fact, you see a large growth of industry in the form of spread out backyard furnaces, they called them, taking coal and burning it to make steel production, all that kind of stuff. These things were working. 58 was a pretty good year for this growth in agriculture and industry, but after that, things are going to get really, really complicated for the Chinese. And it gets complicated because, like most things that involve giving all of the resources and crops and goods to a government, that political bureaucracy can sometimes overcomplicate things and make more red tape and, ineffectiveness. And that's exactly what's happening here in China. And at the same time, very similar to Russia, the goods they are producing in the industries are plentiful, but they are not well made, and things are breaking down as fast as they make them because the workmanship on these items has diminished quite a lot since they initially had these plans. Workers are taken from the farms to kind of stabilize this shoddiness, this ineffectiveness, and that takes workers away from the farms, and that's going to lead to some issues because in 1958, because it was a good year, there were a lot of goods and foods that were produced, but then in 1959 and in 1960 you had 2 years of really bad weather, and so the growing seasons for those years were really poor, so less workers and worse weather equal a lot less in crop yields. Hundreds of millions of pounds of food were not produced as they saw in 1958. Massive widespread famine and weather made these issues even worse for the home front in China. It is estimated that at least 20 million people starved during this Great Leap Forward. Even Mao himself, which led to his eventual resignation, quote unquote, from the head of the Chinese Communist Party, even Mao later admitted that this Great Leap Forward was a failure, but he blamed other people. He blamed the actual workers and the politicians that were doing all the bureaucratic stuff, not himself, of course, for enacting this plan. Coal reserves also started to run out, so those backyard furnaces became less and less efficient. Once again, they didn't produce a lot of good materials from them. It did kind of start, however, that kind of rise of China as an industrial power to kind of rival that of the Western countries. He resigned. To this day, though, he is still beloved by many people who were alive during the time because he did start the Chinese Revolution to oust the final dynasty and to kind of cement a legacy of building a new China for the future as a superpower in their own right. And then what about us and Europe, the U.S.? FDR, the president during World War II, hated the fact that in 1929, the Great Depression was really in full swing. He, as a governor of New York, has a plan. He's elected in 1933, and that plan collectively we call the New Deal. It's a new deal for the citizens. That was his mantra. Once he gets in power, his administration quickly leads to some reforms and things that are going to help the populace come out of the Great Depression. Banking reform, to make it easier to get loans and for banks to kind of take care of sweeping bad loans off the books. Emergency relief programs, like things like welfare and programs designed to help the lower classes who were really, really struggling during this time. Work relief programs and some agricultural programs, all designed to make the everyday middle class and lower class citizen their time and effort well spent. That's the New Deal that he promised, and he's setting that up, and it's actually pretty decently successful in many regards. Later, he launches a second New Deal. This is more geared towards industry and stuff like that. So there's some union protection in there where they don't get, ousted as being anti-economic or anti-capital, right? Unions sometimes get a bad name for kind of squeezing prices for their workers and protecting ineffective workers, et cetera, et cetera. So he's trying to protect some of those programs. And things like the Social Security Act, which is something that your grandparents probably utilize today, and they can work for several years. They pay into a system, and then when they become old and cannot work anymore, they get still a living wage where they can survive and kind of live off of and don't have to be taken care of by a family per se. And agricultural workers with subsidies and stuff are also put into place during the second New Deal. Many of these new agencies that were developed under the New Deals were known by their acronyms, and you can kind of figure out what they are just based on their title. The Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps are two of them. One is designed to help with infrastructure progress, and another one is designed to keep certain populations of citizens in work, doing things that conserve environment or other structures. That way, we can kind of keep the country stabilized here. But by 1939, which is, like I said, 6 years after the initial start date with when he wanted to put the New Deal in, the New Deal had pretty much run its course. It was never designed to be a huge long-term deal. FDR did want the programs to be kind of done away with once they had served their usefulness, which is what pretty much happens. In the short term, lives of people suffering from the Depression are improved overall. Not everybody is making out like a bandit in these deals, but enough people are getting some moderate success improvement there with standard of living and job security, et cetera, that for most part, most historians label the New Deal as a good deal and a successful deal. In the long run, the New Deal does kind of increase or lead to some notions of the federal government playing a role in economic and social affairs. A lot of these changes will be really, really clearly evident as we get through some of the next portions here of this lecture. But long term, it does set a tone for, especially in capitalistic countries, that economic principles can be kind of championed or controlled or manipulated by a federal government in many cases. In Europe, with Mussolini, let's talk about him. He has a simple plan. He's mentioned in some of the fascist corporations that he's going to set up. He, and basic fascism in general, tries to segment the economy into privately controlled corporations or organizations, and those are all going to be managed by the government, his government. And each one will kind of have like its own little trade union and stuff that will negotiate things like labor and pricing and costs and stuff like that. The goal with fascism is to set up a harmony between business and economics and the populace, the culture of the country there. It's a top-down method, which is really complex because obviously when you have the government controlling anything, there's going to be some complexity there because they have to put in all these different controls and stuff. But that's what happens here. Not a hugely successful system because of the fact that World War II kind of deals away with Mussolini and his regime, and that the fact that it is so complicated with working things down from the super rich to the bottom rung of the super poor. And the Roman Catholic Church is kind of the opposite with how they dealt with people helping out with economics. The Catholic Church says people from the bottom should be given most of the breaks, and then they'll work their way up, and it'll make the people at the top slightly or wealthy and all that kind of stuff. Whereas fascism says we need to control this from the top down, and so the Roman Catholic Church situated in Italy is going to have some issues there with that. Maybe some tension points there to look at that aren't really hugely important, but still something to look at, interestingly enough. Slowly, fascism does spread to other countries, including the rise of fascism as a political party in several of your Western European countries like Great Britain and France. America has some fascist, small minority party affiliation in some pockets, but it is spreading throughout Europe as an idea of top-down type of approaching. Another notable areas of government interference that you should probably know about. We talked about the major ones in Europe and the West, and you mentioned the major ones in the East, but there are some in the middle there a little bit. You've got Egypt, which has been slowly kind of, becoming their own, not a superpower per se, but a nice little force to be reckoned with in Northern Africa and the Middle East especially, led by a gentleman by the name of Nasser. He is going to encourage private capital, at least until 1952, and they have some storage there of some funds to kind of do infrastructure and what he wants to do. When he gets in power, socialism will kind of come in and take over of spreading out equality and things. And then in the 60s, Nasser himself will nationalize a bunch of industries like oil and cotton production, et cetera, et cetera. Mining's another one, power. The whole point of nationalization is the government takes those industries out of private hands and runs them themselves. So private capital until 52. Post 52, a slow rise of nationalism, and mining, cotton, power production are the main big ones. Large trade deficits occur of this because of this. Egypt is selling goods to other countries, but they are not able to buy goods back cheaply enough from other countries. So they're exporting, but not importing as much, with the same equal kind of rate. And so gold reserves in Egypt are dwindling, and at the same time, they are also trying to build up a military to do what's called pan-Arabism and kind of lead to this like joint Arab world. One of the big crises there they face is from the rise of Israel, and then the Suez Canal concerns, where Great Britain was helping France to build the Suez Canal, and then they gave it kind of to Egypt, and Egypt nationalized it, and then they wouldn't let other countries go through there, and of course that made England and France kind of step in, and they fought some campaigns there, and those issues are going to make this a lot more complicated when it comes to foreign relationships between Egypt and with Nasser and the West. Nasser's becoming unstable at that point. Pan-Arabism, the Six-Day War defeat, stresses him out. He has a heart attack in 1970, which is a couple years after he resigns. He dies in 1970, and then you have a total, power vacuum in Egypt, which is, every once in a while becoming more and more of a global issue as we move through some of the Arab revolts of the modern age. And then when you have the Asian tigers, non-China, right, non-Japan, you've got the developing countries that are in Asia that kind of have to have some kind of strategy for economics coming out of World War II. Who's going to tip the balance there? Is it capitalism or is it communism, et cetera, et cetera? So several of these Asian tigers take some really bold initiatives to kind of make trading within their little region a lot more successful, like reducing tariffs, which are basically taxes on goods that are exported/imported. Some of these Asian tigers float exchange rates, floats in parentheses there, because you're going to kind of see a very fluid and flexible exchange rate that kind of goes and ebbs and flows, not as rigid as some of your Western countries especially. So it can kind of move and help out if they need interest rates to be lower to spark investment or building or loan making and stuff like that. They can do that. If things are going too loose and they need to tighten it up a little bit to kind of control other aspects of the economy, they can do that as well. And then finally, the government is supporting exporting sectors here. That means that the government is supporting different industries that are goods that want to be produced by industries within these territories. The Asian tigers, the ones that we know, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, which is a really nice collection of up-and-coming Asian countries that are not dominated, obviously, China and Japan. The strategy of the Asian tigers is nice for the short term. They form a nice little niche in a world economy because they produce certain goods that are sought after by the West and everybody else. Certain types of exports. However, there are some issues that are going to be raised up when the government starts putting more and more subsidies on agriculture, where they're paying some people to farm and some people not to farm in order to kind of keep prices at an elevated level and that kind of deal. Access to local markets is going to be the norm that is going to be championed by the lower class, middle class workers here. And then gaining hard currency to import commodities can be much more complicated than the Asian tigers seem it is. And so manufactured goods can be made cheaply somewhere else. Import less and then export things with more profit. That's the goal. So they want to gain currency through that. Okay, sell goods for higher than you have to buy goods. So now we start talking about free market approach, Cold War free market approaches, and there are many ones that are really important. You could do a whole class just on the modern age of free market approaches. Capitalism is trying to win out, and you've got a couple of major spots where free market, having this open, unregulated type of market, is going to be championed. We'll start with America, Reaganomics, which is what it's commonly known as. Some negative opponents of Reagan later on will call this Voodoo Economics because of the magic that's behind it, they say. It's supply side, which is like a trickle-down type of deal. The goal is to produce so much stuff that the people that are making money, the companies, can make so much that they can, now trickle down profit to their workers or to cheap goods, which will help the middle classes and lower classes. All these things trickle down. Reagan does lots of tax cuts for the super wealthy up top and businesses especially, and relaxes several regulations on corporations. He wants them to produce lots and lots of goods, and the wealthy people that are also in that upper echelon of social classes will also have those tax cuts help them out. And this is a up and down type of result here. GDP, which is what Reagan really cares about, gross domestic product, that does grow. However, there's not as much tax money coming in, so it leads to massive deficits. And he is happy with that because, once again, the GDP is growing, which means that more goods are being produced. However, the wealth divide that we would commonly kind of realize today for America, which is still around, where the rich are rich, the poor are poor, and there's this big, middle ground. Those things are starting to happen more and more during the Reaganomics, Voodoo Economics phase. Great Britain, with Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, the Prime Minister of Great Britain eventually, who worked well with Reagan and some of the predecessors and stuff. It's going to lead to a system known as Thatcherism, where she is trying to get the government out of the way of business. Once again, her main goal is to actually stick to defense of the realm and currency and not be involved in other aspects. So you're hopefully seeing some very down the road issues here with capitalism versus communism, with how the government is getting involved. One is full-on government regulation and everything is involved, and the other is, once again, free market, so it's totally hands-off. Well, not totally, but mostly hands-off. To get back to Great Britain under Margaret Thatcher, she wants high interest rates to kind of deal with inflation, right? Money that's less valuable or more valuable than it's supposed to be. She kind of has to curb that a little bit. Tax cuts as well, so similar to Reaganomics. And once again, get the government out of certain industries they had taken control of during World War II. She does not want to be in the communistic sort of, we need to control this industry, so she slowly backs Britain out of owning some of those industries. And then finally, we talk about China. China, we don't think of as a free market because we think of it as a communistic country. I just mentioned several of their plans under Mao. However, Mao's not going to be around forever. He will resign, quote unquote, from the party as chairman. Eventually, he passes away. When he passes away, you have a little bit of instability, but eventually this gentleman by the name of Deng Xiaopeng takes over, and he's got a plan for 4 distinct modernizations: agriculture, industry, technology, and defense. However, to bring about any of those, you need money. You need surplus, right? And you need capital, startup money. And so he's got some phases here for kind of getting that surplus to happen. Phase 1 is known as the CRS, the Contract Responsibility System. Basically, the quota system that was instilled under the 5-year plan or so, or the Great Leap Forward by Mao, he wants less government tie-in to the results, positive and negative. So typically the government came down on you if you weren't producing, right? They could punish you really, really harshly. And if you were producing, you weren't getting enough credit and all that kind of stuff. So workers lost motivation. That was part of the problem. They were producing, poor goods and stuff when they were producing goods. Well, he wants to remove that government tie-in. So wealth goes back into the hands of the factory workers and owners, especially. Negatives don't get brought down on so hard, and so workers become more and more motivated. The relaxing of quotas is the major one for there. Lowering the amount of stuff you have to produce will make you hopefully produce better quality things that you can sell for more money. That's Deng's little mantra there, hope. And then phase 2 is a dual track system. This is when you literally had the mixture of planned economy and market economies. One where the government controlled pricing, and then the other where the actual economic principles of the product or whatever controlled pricing. You saw literally 2 prices for goods because you had this mixture of these 2 economy types, one under a planned and one under a market. And this works out really well for the peasants because they could buy low goods that are produced under the planned economy. They could buy them for cheap, and then they could sell them to outside markets for high, the market economy, right? This led to a really good increase in standard of living, which is good for your lower middle classes. To finish up with Deng and his modernizations, agriculture is an important part of that, and this modernization will allow Deng to shift more towards industry. He will lead, because of the goods being produced that are better quality, agricultural production and fertilizers and pesticides being used more and more will kind of jumpstart agriculture, and the commune system is slowly getting phased out, and once again people start being able to grow their own cash crops once they make their lessened quotas for their normal staple crops. Industry-wise, he creates special economic zones, SEZs. These are very distinct areas of the country, usually a port city, where there are very business-friendly laws. Those laws are typically different than non-special zones. So harsh communistic laws or whatever, give or take, in the non-zones, more capitalistic-friendly laws in the economic zones. There's a good chance that goods that are worn or utilized by yourself that are made in China, if you look at manufacturing information, are made and distributed and sold and stuff in these special economic zones. This is all going to result in the economic juggernaut that China is today because they have tons of workers to throw at these industries. And if you can control pricing in certain regards and make lots of profit in other regards because you have that mixture of the 2 approaches, planned and market, you can really make lots of profit. And that's what we're seeing with China, one of the biggest holders of American debt even now. One more that was mentioned in your curriculum stuff is Chile under Pinochet. Pinochet takes over for Salvador Allende, and he is going to install an idea of economic liberalization. He wants to take state-owned companies and privatize them, so kind of go back and put them in the hands of the freer type market. Once again, inflation is one of his goals as well. Stabilize inflation, make Chilean goods more captivating for a global audience, and that'll help stabilize the economic success there. So in 85, the first wave's already gone through and been decently successful. The government starts the second phase of privatization, and they take the tariff increases and they revise those. They give a central bank a supervisory role. They give it more power and authority. And unfortunately, because that means that foreign countries are trading more and more with Chile, they're also exploiting Chile with these tariffs, these low tariffs, and this greater diminished result that the central bank brought in. And so massive poverty sweeps the country, and there's a massive class divide. All those things will undermine the government of Pinochet, and eventually he is ousted in election. What results of this is a couple of things. You got a couple of trade agreements and organizations that are set up. Some of them are World War II-ish, some of them go beyond. Let's start talking about the International Monetary Fund. 1944, you got 189 countries that have a nice little mission statement. I'll let you read it. Basically, the IMF is a cross between a central bank and a trade organization. They can make loans and collect funds from member countries, and then they dish those things out to developing countries that need help because, once again, they're developing. In trade, you kind of make a common market type of area where goods can be exchanged without the kind of strings attached that you can find in the open market between two countries per se. They do loan and have floating exchange rates, which are all certain types of aid that you can give to developing countries, poor countries. Some would consider third world, second world, obviously a part of that too. And as of 2016, the members have paid in $670 billion in funds that they currently can use to issue these loans and all these kind of principles they want to do. So not underestimated there. The World Bank is also in 1944 coming out of what's called the Bretton Woods Conference. A bunch of really, really important economic people come together and they come up with these ideas. One of them is the World Bank, created by the UN, and it also is geared more towards developing countries and helping them do things because they don't have capital. Capital improvements is what it's called. Really, truly, they want to reduce poverty because poverty is a crippler for labor and for certain industries. So if you can make people happier and maybe able to survive more and more easily, they can help all these developing countries become developed countries like America and the Europeans. Originally, it is very European-centric, designed to kind of help out with post-war buildup and stabilization. However, once that kind of is not needed anymore, they do expand to be used for non-European countries. We see a lot of things in a decolonized Africa. We see a lot of South American, loan being issued, and some other locations as well. But that's the main target after, stabilization has happened. And then finally, they expand their mission statement down the road, and it leads to newer mission statements being added that are not simply directly economic, but are instead more social, like disease eradication and education for the masses. Some of those things are still issues moving forward a couple decades, so obviously the World Bank will help with that, especially if money can be used for programs and stuff to help those things get fixed and resolved. Some more institutions here that you need to keep an eye on. The World Trade Organization. This was created in 1995 and deals with regulation of trade between the participating countries. You can meet at a central spot or whatever to negotiate agreements, whether they be trade or labor, whatever. Or you can also resolve disputes. So contracts weren't lived up to, or somebody's doing unfair practices. You can kind of meet and discuss those things and kind of fix them. And then when fair trade gets brought up, with more and more emphasis on agricultural subsidies going from one place to another and becoming really, really popular in some of these zones like South America and Africa, et cetera, you have the rise of more regional scale organizations, many of which will be discussed here towards the end of this lecture. And that kind of makes this one obsolete. The World Trade Organization, loses its luster here once regional trade organizations get created. And then finally, things that you should know about, multinational corporations, because you see several every day. These are large-scale corporations that are centralized in one country, but sell goods and services in various other countries without a lot of direct government control because they can move plants and bases and stuff like that whenever they want. So governments have less leverage over them. They are all about importing and exporting goods and services to make profit. You know some of their names: Honda, Sony, Microsoft, General Motors, Exxon. There are many others. Walmart's a current one, et cetera, that you can point to. They make significant investments in foreign countries, especially developing ones. They can put factories in for cheap and get cheaper labor because obviously they're all about profit. They buy and sell those licenses to put those factories and stuff. They put them in foreign markets, which kind of helps out in those areas and makes goods cheaper they can sell in other areas. They do engage for a large part in contract manufacturing, so setting up shop in a local area to produce goods, and then they take those goods in sort of this kind of weird industrial revolution way back to the factory or the plants where their main hub is, and they can kind of turn those into other more refined goods. So a cool process here for helping to bring money and distributing it throughout the world. Obviously the factories and the facilities they build are their main leverage. So if, like, for example, America is putting certain regulations on General Motors that they don't like, they can just put a factory in Mexico or Canada and produce the goods that they need to produce, and America won't be getting that tax revenue and all that kind of stuff. So you've got some free market leverage here being used by factories and by owners, by these companies, these multinational companies, because they can go wherever they want. They're just looking for, somebody who can work with them so they can make more profit. Single governments, therefore, lose the leverage to regulate them, which is why we get to, issues with, say, Microsoft with their antitrust stuff, where they were producing things that nobody else could copy. That was a big deal. So governments, harder and harder to police. Finally, those organizations I talked about, those more regional ones. Hear the bell here. Those more regional ones that made some of the other ones more obsolete. The European Economic Community is one of them. 1957, this is the granddad to the European Union, which is all about a common market and a commonly shared customs union. Economic integration by all these totally different markets. That's the whole goal. Free movement of goods and capital and services and people within the member countries. It starts off with 6, and by 1994 there's 15. Once again, kind of gets absorbed into what we would now consider to be the European Union. That model of the EU is what's going to come out of this system moving forward. You have the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. This is a trade bloc between the 3 countries of North America: Mexico, Canada, and the United States. They want to eliminate barriers to trade between the 3, which is really just tariff elimination, those taxes between goods that are exchanged. They want to eliminate those. So over a course of 10 to 15 years, that's the goal under President Clinton and the Canada and Mexican presidents. They want to eliminate those tariffs and once again kind of stabilize and make it more fair, or free and fair, I should say. As a result, Canada is really a huge benefactor in this. Mexico also is a benefactor, not as grand as Canada, but they still make off pretty well. The USA, which has already been way above the other 2, has some marginal improvements when it comes to economic output and kind of distribution, but we weren't trying to grow leaps and bounds. We were just trying to work better with our neighbors, and we did. And then you have the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations, ASEAN is what it's known as. This is Southeast Asia's version of NAFTA, although it is created before NAFTA, which is a little bit weird. 1967, accelerating economic growth within the countries of Southeast Asia, which is not the big boys. You're not thinking of Canada, China, Korea, Japan, all those places. You're not talking about those. You're talking about the ones in Southeast Asia. So look at your map and find those out. Social progress is also part of the culture there. Socio-cultural evolution, protection of regional stability, and provisions for resolving disputes. Free market approaches is all about making things a lot easier to trade, and if there are issues, fixing those issues without having a war, right? That's what we want to avoid. Another major war. If all these territories that make up ASEAN were a single entity, it would be the 6th ranked total GDP in the world. So it's not underestimated how important this area is. And then you have Mercosur, which is the South American version of ASEAN. This was created in 91. It promotes, as you can probably tell, a fluid movement of good, people, and currency, backed by Spanish and Portuguese language are the main official ones, and creates a customs union where we can kind of get through the red tape of moving goods from one border to another. And free trade is created, and the trading bloc is actually created. It's a common market, right? Think of a common market where you can kind of put all your goods and not have to be so cutthroat with, buying one things from one people or another. This tilts modern day towards the main members, Brazil being the biggest one. So they're going to ones that are going to kind of capitalize on this. And so we're done. So generally speaking, what has happened through all this free market trade discussion and battle between communism and capitalism? Well, generally speaking, people like having stuff, and they like having cheap stuff. That way they can use that money on other stuff. So eventually capitalism wins. So even if the Cold War has complicated things on a political scale, capitalism on an economic scale is the champion of this contest. And they even move into communistic countries like China, for example. Capitalism wins. In your study guide and your key concept information when you start studying, all of the 6.3i information and A and B for 6.3.2 can now be finished, and you want to make sure that you are looking at tie-ins whenever possible between certain events of the Cold War and this material. And if you're looking at themes, definitely politics and social mixing in with economics. Okay, so when you start looking at your thematic learning objectives, those things will definitely tie together. You want to make sure that you are making those connections if at all possible. Hope you learned a lot about economics, Voodoo Economics, and hopefully you're not asleep.